My brother accidentally sent me a voice note meant for our parents, and what I heard forced me to leave the house that same night. The evening felt ordinary in the quiet way weekdays often do. I was sitting on my bed with the light half on, scrolling without focus. The house settled into its usual sounds. Pipes clicked. The television murmured somewhere down the hall. Nothing felt off. When my phone vibrated, I didn't even look at the screen before tapping play. A voice note from my brother wasn't unusual. He preferred talking instead of typing, especially when he was tired. His voice came through relaxed, almost lazy. The same tone he used when complaining about work or making plans for the weekend. I listened without thinking, absently watching the shadows on the wall. Then he said my parents' names. Not casually. Not the way you mention someone in passing. It was direct, deliberate. The kind of address meant for an audience that wasn't me. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't stop it. Something in his delivery shifted. The warmth dropped out. His words became cleaner, firmer, like he was laying something out step by step. He started talking about me, but not as a brother would. I wasn't a person in his voice. I was an issue, a complication, something that needed to be handled. I felt my body lock in place while the recording kept going. He spoke with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing you'll be agreed with. He referenced frustrations I'd never heard out loud, framed as facts rather than feelings. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. I realized he wasn't venting. He was reporting, explaining, making a case. Then came the line that broke whatever balance I thought existed. He talked about timing, about what would be easiest, about how things would work once a change was made. There was no hesitation in his voice. No doubt. Just confidence that the house, the space I thought I belonged in, was temporary by design. When the message ended, the silence felt loud. I didn't move right away. I stared at my phone like it had betrayed me, then looked around the room I'd slept in for years. The walls hadn't changed. The floor was the same. But something underneath everything had shifted. I understood then that safety isn't about locked doors or familiar rooms. It's about knowing you're wanted where you stand. Sitting there, surrounded by things that suddenly felt borrowed, I realized the place I was in had already decided I didn't belong. Before that night, our family looked normal from the outside. Two parents, two kids, one house that had held the same routines for years. Nothing dramatic ever happened. No screaming matches. No doors slammed hard enough to crack the frame. That was part of what made everything harder to name. The damage lived in tone, in expectation, in who was allowed to take up space without explanation. My parents valued order more than openness. Feelings were acceptable as long as they were neat and short-lived. Anything complicated was quietly redirected or brushed aside. Problems weren't discussed so much as managed. Image mattered. Stability mattered. Keeping things looking fine carried more weight than asking whether they actually were. Conflict didn't explode in our home. It dissolved into silence. My brother fit easily into that system. He was dependable, agreeable, good at anticipating what was wanted before anyone had to say it. Teachers liked him. Relatives praised him. He moved through the house without friction. If something needed to be handled, he handled it. If someone needed reassurance, he provided it in the right tone. He made things smooth. I didn't move the same way. I asked questions that slowed conversations down. I reacted instead of absorbing. I noticed gaps between what was said and what was meant. That made me inconvenient. Not bad. Not dangerous. Just harder to place. I was labeled sensitive early on, a word that followed me quietly. It explained away discomfort without addressing it. There was never a moment where I was told I didn't belong. That's why it took so long to recognize the pattern. I was included, but conditionally. Listened to, but selectively. Supported, but only when my needs aligned with everyone else's comfort. I learned to second-guess myself before speaking, to read the room before reacting, to shrink without being asked. Looking back, I see how easy it was to miss what was happening. Nothing hurt enough to demand attention. Nothing crossed a line that could be clearly pointed to. The imbalance was subtle, built over time, reinforced through praise given elsewhere and tolerance offered to me. I didn't feel rejected. I felt slightly off-center, like a chair pulled just far enough away from the table to make reaching uncomfortable. That night didn't create the truth. It exposed it. My brother and I didn't talk on the phone much. None of us did, really. In our family, communication happened in short bursts. Text for logistics, voice notes when someone didn't feel like typing. It was normal to open the chat and see a 2-minute recording waiting there, usually about groceries, schedules, or something my parents needed handled. His messages were usually casual, sometimes even lazy, sent without much thought. Because of that, I didn't hesitate when my phone lit up that evening. What stood out was how little context there was. No follow-up text, no explanation, just the audio file sitting there with his name on it. I remember staring at the screen for a second longer than usual, wondering if he meant to send it to me or if it was one of those group messages that accidentally landed in the wrong place. I almost expected another notification to come through immediately saying, "Wrong chat," or "Ignore that." Nothing came. I hit play without really thinking. At first, it sounded like any other message he'd sent. Same rhythm, same familiar cadence. He was talking easily, like he always did, and my body stayed relaxed. I leaned back on the couch, phone resting loosely in my hand. Then there was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. And he said our parents' names. That was the moment something shifted. I sat up straight, thumb hovering over the screen. A quiet warning went off in my head, telling me this wasn't meant for me. I considered stopping it right there. I even pulled the phone slightly away, like distance could undo what was already happening. But curiosity, mixed with unease, kept my fingers still. I told myself it would only be a few more seconds, that I should know what was being said about me, even if I wasn't supposed to hear it. The longer I listened, the heavier the room felt. Each sentence made it harder to stop. By the time I realized I should turn it off, the damage was already unfolding, word by word, with nowhere to go. The longer the recording played, the clearer it became that my brother wasn't venting. He sounded comfortable, almost amused, like he was reciting a story everyone already knew by heart. He talked about me the way people talk about a broken appliance they're tired of fixing. Nothing sharp, nothing loud, just casual remarks layered with certainty. He said I moved slowly through life, that I overthought simple things, that I needed too much reassurance. His tone stayed light, almost playful, as if he expected laughter on the other end. What hurt most wasn't the criticism itself. It was how familiar it all sounded. He described me as someone who leaned too much, someone who took more than he gave, someone who turned small issues into exhausting events. He didn't sound angry. He sounded practiced, like these words had been used before, refined over time, smoothed down until they felt harmless. He framed my presence in the house as a favor, not a shared reality, something temporary that had gone on longer than expected. At one point, he joked that I was still figuring things out, even though I was well past the age where that excuse made sense. He laughed softly after saying it, the kind of laugh meant to invite agreement. He talked as if our parents were already nodding along, already tired, already waiting for me to move on so things could feel lighter again. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty. He spoke like someone summarizing a group decision. Then came the part that made my chest tighten. He mentioned how it was understood that I wouldn't be there much longer. Not said directly, not spelled out, but implied in a way that felt deliberate. Like my staying had an expiration date everyone else knew about. He said it would be better for everyone once I had my own place, my own problems, my own space to deal with whatever I was going through. The way he said it made it sound generous, even kind. As I listened, certain phrases stood out. Words I'd heard before, usually delivered gently at dinner or slipped into conversations when tension needed smoothing. Hearing them come from his mouth confirmed something I hadn't wanted to face. These weren't his thoughts alone. They were shared language, reused ideas, agreed upon descriptions. Sitting there in the quiet, I understood that this version of me had been discussed, shaped, and accepted long before that message was sent. The tone shifted without warning. My brother stopped circling the issue and said something that felt final. He talked about timing, about how things couldn't stay the way they were much longer. He mentioned that it would be better to push me sooner rather than later, before I got too comfortable. The words landed softly, but the meaning underneath them was solid and heavy. He wasn't guessing. He was outlining a plan. He explained it like a favor, said pressure might be what I needed, that being forced to handle things on my own would help me grow. He framed it as concern, as responsibility, as tough love. There was no hesitation when he spoke, no question marks hidden in his tone. He sounded certain that this was the right move, that everyone involved understood their role. Listening to him, I realized he wasn't asking for permission. He was updating them. One sentence in particular made my hands start to shake. He said it would be easier if it happened quickly, before I had time to argue or spiral. That word stuck with me. Spiral. Like my reactions were already known, already expected, already dismissed. He spoke as if my response was just another inconvenience to manage, not something that mattered. In that moment, I understood that my feelings were not part of the equation. I sat there, barely breathing, as the rest of the message played out. He talked about consequences, about how discomfort would push me forward, about how everyone would be relieved once things settled. It became clear that discussions had happened without me, that decisions had been shaped and agreed upon while I was still believing I belonged there. The house around me didn't feel like shelter anymore. It felt like a waiting room I was about to be asked to leave. After the message ended, I didn't move right away. I just sat there, staring at nothing, while pieces of old moments began sliding into place. Things I had brushed off before started resurfacing with new weight. Small comments my parents used to make about me needing space, about learning independence, about how my brother had always been more settled. At the time, I took those words as concern or advice. Now they sounded like preparation. I thought about dinners where conversations stopped when I entered the room, about how plans were discussed around me, not with me. I remembered how my parents rarely defended me outright, choosing quiet instead. I had always told myself they were avoiding tension, that silence meant neutrality. Sitting there, replaying the message in my head, I understood that quiet had been a choice, not ignorance. Agreement. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my brother wasn't acting alone. He wasn't inventing anything. He was delivering something that had already been decided, shaped by conversations I wasn't invited into. His confidence made sense now. He wasn't worried about backlash because he wasn't the source. He was the voice, the translator, the one willing to say out loud what others preferred to imply. Memories stacked up fast. The way my parents praised him for being responsible while describing me as complicated. The way my needs were framed as stress instead of signals. The way support always came with conditions. None of it had felt cruel on its own. Together, it formed a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. What hurt most was realizing this wasn't sudden. There was no single breaking point. No argument I could point to. This had been building quietly while I assumed I was still part of the same story. The message didn't create the problem. It exposed it. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee how long I'd been standing on the edge without knowing it. When the recording stopped, the room felt louder than it had while the words were playing. The screen went dark, and my phone rested in my hand like it had weight. I expected something to happen next. A correction. A second message. Anything that would suggest a mistake. I checked the chat again, refreshed it once, then again. Nothing followed. I sat there waiting, telling myself he would realize what he'd done and rush to explain. Minutes passed without a vibration or a sound. The house stayed still. No footsteps. No voices. Just the hum of something electrical in the background. I watched the time on my phone change and felt each minute stretch longer than it should have. I didn't reply. I didn't know how. Part of me hoped silence meant he hadn't noticed yet, that he was busy, that a clarification was coming. Another part of me understood what the quiet really was. He wasn't worried. He wasn't scrambling. The lack of urgency said more than any apology could have. If he had sent that message by accident, he would have reacted immediately. I kept my phone close, like it might suddenly come alive with explanations or excuses. It stayed blank. The absence settled in slowly, heavy and unmistakable. That silence wasn't neutral. It was confirmation. It told me the message had landed exactly where it wasn't supposed to, and no one planned to fix that. I forced myself to move through the rest of the evening like nothing had shifted, even though everything had. I left my room, stepped into shared spaces, and let my face settle into something neutral. Conversation happened around me in short exchanges. Polite questions. Simple answers. My parents spoke kindly, but there was a thin distance in their voices, like they were careful not to linger. It felt rehearsed, measured, controlled. My brother stayed nearby, but never fully present. He kept his attention on his phone, on the television, on anything that wasn't me. When our paths crossed, he nodded without looking up. No tension spilled into the open, yet the air felt tight. Every interaction carried a strange restraint, as if everyone was silently checking themselves to avoid saying the wrong thing. I paid attention to small details. The way my parents asked where I'd be the next day instead of what I planned to do. The way my brother left the room when I entered it. The way jokes stopped short and smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Nothing was openly hostile. That almost made it worse. The calm felt fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it. I tested the edges quietly, asked an ordinary question about the weekend, mentioned an errand I needed to run. Each response came back clipped and careful, like they were choosing safety over honesty. No one challenged me. No one reassured me either. It was clear I was being observed, not included. By the end of the night, I understood something without it being said aloud. I wasn't in danger of an argument. I was in danger of being managed. And that kind of quiet can be far more unsettling than raised voices. I didn't mean to hear it. I was standing near the hallway, pretending to look for something I didn't need, when their voices carried from the kitchen. They weren't whispering, just speaking in that low, practical tone people use when they believe the conversation is settled. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as if my body already knew what my mind hadn't caught up to yet. My brother was talking again, and this time there was no performance in his voice. He sounded focused. He repeated the same ideas from the message, almost word for word, but without the humor. He talked about timelines, about how long things could realistically continue, about what would happen if nothing changed. My parents responded calmly, not with shock or protest, but with follow-up questions, clarifications, adjustments. It sounded like planning, not debate. One of them mentioned pressure the same way you'd mention weather. Another brought up consequences, phrased as inevitabilities rather than choices. Nobody sounded upset. Nobody sounded conflicted. They were discussing my life the way people discuss schedules or budgets. Efficient, detached, final. Hearing those familiar phrases repeated out loud confirmed what I'd tried to doubt. That voice note wasn't a one-off. It was a summary. What unsettled me most was how urgent it felt. Not emotional urgency, but logistical urgency. Like something needed to be done soon to avoid inconvenience. I heard my brother say it would be easier if things happened quickly. That waiting would only complicate matters. My parents didn't disagree. One of them even said something about timing being important, about avoiding scenes. Standing there, I understood that staying meant becoming part of a process I couldn't control. There would be no discussion, no warning framed as kindness. Just action, followed by explanations I wasn't meant to argue with. The realization settled fast and heavy. This wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about execution. And that was the moment I knew I couldn't wait until morning. I went back to my room and closed the door without making a sound. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the floor while everything replayed in my head. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd misunderstood. That maybe I was overreacting, letting fear fill in gaps that weren't really there. I considered staying quiet, keeping my head down, waiting to see what happened. That option felt easier in the moment, but heavier the longer I sat with it. Another part of me was painfully clear. Staying meant being watched, discussed, decided for. It meant waking up every day knowing plans were forming without my input. The thought tightened my chest. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of slowly disappearing while still standing in the same house. That fear carried more weight than the uncertainty of leaving. I looked around the room, at things I'd collected over years, and realized how little of it mattered compared to my sense of safety. My hands stopped shaking once the decision settled in. There was no dramatic rush, no spike of adrenaline. Just a quiet understanding that staying would do more damage than leaving ever could. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront anyone. I started packing only what I needed, moving carefully, deliberately. Each item I put into my bag felt like a small reclaiming of control. By the time I zipped it shut, the doubt was gone. I wasn't running. I was choosing myself. I packed slowly, guided more by instinct than logic. The house had settled into its nighttime stillness, the kind that made every small sound feel louder than it should have been. I moved carefully, lifting drawers instead of letting them slide, folding clothes instead of shaking them out. I chose only what I could carry without struggle. Basics first. A change of clothes. Documents. Phone charger. Things that meant survival, not comfort. Every object I touched tried to pull me backward. A book I hadn't finished. A hoodie that still smelled familiar. Photos tucked into a drawer I rarely opened. I paused more than once, hand hovering, deciding whether memory was worth the wait. Most of the time, it wasn't. I reminded myself that I wasn't erasing my past, just refusing to let it trap me in place. Still, the hesitation lingered with each choice. I kept listening for movement outside my room. A cough, a footstep, a voice calling my name. Nothing came. The quiet pressed in, heavy but undisturbed, like the house itself was holding its breath. That silence made it easier to continue. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want permission. When the bag was finally ready, I stood by the door longer than I expected. My hand rested on the handle, cool against my palm. I took one last look around, not with sadness, but with clarity. This room had kept me contained, not protected. Opening the door felt less like leaving and more like stepping out of something that no longer fit. The place I ended up wasn't special. It was borrowed, temporary, and unfamiliar, but it was quiet. I sat on the edge of a mattress that didn't belong to me, listening to sounds I couldn't predict, and felt my body finally react to everything I'd been holding in. My shoulders ached. My head felt hollow. Still, there was a strange lightness underneath the discomfort, like pressure easing after being held too long. Nothing about that night felt comfortable. The room was too cold, the air smelled wrong, and every movement reminded me how abruptly my life had shifted. I kept my bag close, not because I was afraid someone would take it, but because it was proof I'd made it out with myself intact. I checked my phone more than once, half expecting messages to appear. None did. The absence felt different away from that house. Less threatening, more honest. Lying there, sleep came in fragments. I drifted, woke, drifted again. Each time I opened my eyes, I remembered where I was and why. Fear tried to creep in, whispering questions about what came next. I didn't answer them. That night wasn't about solving anything. It was about getting through. What surprised me most was the silence. Not the kind that waits to be filled, but the kind that simply exists. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt neutral, safe, even. For the first time in a long while, no one was talking about me in the next room. No plans were being shaped around my absence. I was just there, breathing, uncomfortable, alive. And for that moment, that was enough. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stay quiet. Missed calls stacked up without leaving voicemails, like someone knocking repeatedly but refusing to say why. Messages followed soon after, arriving one by one, each carrying a slightly different tone. Concern came first, thin and carefully worded. Questions about where I was, whether I was safe, why I'd left without saying anything. None of them acknowledged what I had heard. As the day went on, the language shifted. Worry gave way to irritation. I was told this had all been blown out of proportion, that I'd misunderstood something private, that leaving so suddenly had caused unnecessary stress. The focus moved quickly away from my reasons and landed squarely on my reaction. I was framed as impulsive, dramatic, difficult. Familiar labels, recycled and polished. My brother finally sent a message. He said the voice note wasn't meant the way it sounded. Claimed I'd taken fragments without context. He wrote that he was trying to help, that everything had been said out of care, that no one wanted me gone. Reading his words, I felt the same calm certainty he'd had in his voice the night before. Not apology, control. He suggested we talk later, when I was less emotional. What struck me wasn't the blame itself, but how quickly the story changed. Overnight, I went from problem to overreactor, from someone discussed quietly to someone accused openly. There was no curiosity about why I felt unsafe. No acknowledgement of urgency, just a rush to smooth things over and pull me back into a version of events that protected them. Seeing it laid out so clearly stripped away the last of my doubt. The messages weren't about connection. They were about regaining narrative. And for the first time, I didn't feel tempted to correct it. I recognized manipulation not as cruelty, but as familiarity dressed up as concern. I replied once. Just once. I kept it short, careful, stripped of emotion. I told them I had heard the voice note. I said it clearly, without accusation, without explanation layered on top. I didn't argue details or debate intent. I named the thing that changed everything and waited. The response came fast. Too fast. They told me I'd taken it the wrong way. That tone had been exaggerated by stress. That conversations between family members weren't meant to be dissected so closely. Someone said it was never that serious. Another said I should have come to them instead of disappearing. No one asked what it felt like to hear myself discussed like a problem with a deadline. They focused on delivery instead of content, on phrasing instead of meaning. I was told words sound harsher when overheard. That context mattered, that I should know them better than that. Each message worked to shrink what I'd heard until it was something small enough to dismiss. Something inconvenient, but forgivable. Something that didn't justify distance. As I read their replies, something settled in me. I realized it didn't matter how clearly I explained. There was no version of my truth that would be received without being reshaped. Understanding wasn't the goal. Resolution was. Comfort. Restoration of the old balance where my discomfort was negotiable. So I stopped responding. Not out of anger, not to punish anyone. I simply recognized the moment had passed. I'd said what needed saying. Whether they accepted it or not no longer felt like my responsibility. That wasn't reconciliation. It was closure. Once things quieted down, I finally had space to think without interruption. What lingered wasn't shock anymore, but clarity. Betrayal didn't arrive as a single sharp moment. It spread slowly, backward and forward at the same time, rewriting memories I thought were solid. I realized my brother hadn't misspoken or lost control. He hadn't slipped. He had spoken freely because he believed the ground beneath him was stable. That confidence came from knowing he wasn't alone in what he said. The hardest part was accepting that love in that house had always come with conditions. Support existed as long as I fit into a version of myself that made things easier for others. The moment I became inconvenient, the language shifted. Care turned into management. Patience turned into pressure. Hearing it out loud didn't create the truth, it removed the cover from it. I used to believe safety came from staying close, from enduring discomfort quietly, from proving I could adapt. Leaving showed me how wrong that was. Safety came the moment I stepped away from conversations where my presence was negotiable. It came from choosing distance over constant justification. It came from trusting my reaction instead of doubting it. I don't hate them. That surprised me. Anger burned off quickly, leaving something steadier behind. Understanding. Not the kind that excuses behavior, but the kind that explains patterns. My brother wasn't the architect of my exclusion. He was simply the one willing to name it plainly. That honesty, accidental as it was, gave me something I didn't know I needed. I still think about that night sometimes. Not with regret, but with a strange gratitude. If that message had never arrived, I might still be sitting in that house, shrinking slowly, convincing myself discomfort was normal. Instead, I left with my sense of self intact. Some doors don't close loudly. They stop feeling safe, and that's enough.